trailer contains all of the lumber I need to frame my new shed, and in this video I'm going to take you through that entire process. I knew I was going to be building the walls on the slab, so I started by sweeping it off clean, and then we laid down the pressure treated lumber that I'm using as my bottom wall plates and drilled them out for the wall anchors. Then we used clamps to attach the top plate and the bottom plate together, and then marked them every 16 inches on center for our studs. You can see here we're making a mark and then putting an X to one side, and the X indicates the side of the line that the studs will be installed on. Once the top and bottom plates were marked, it was easy to lay out the studs, and then using a framing nailer, I put 2 nails in the bottom and in the top of each stud. These 2 walls went really quickly, and after we'd built the 2 long walls, we stacked one on top of the other so we could start to sheet them. I figured sheeting them would be easier when they were still on the ground than after we'd stood them up. Now, one mistake we made here, I got a little bit anxious to start nailing in these sheets, and we hadn't squared up the walls yet. So here you can see we're using a tape measure to square the walls, and it turns out we actually were pretty square to begin with. So no harm done on this wall, and on the next wall we were sure to square it before we nailed in any of the sheeting. So once the wall was sheeted, the last thing to do before standing it up was to install this sill plate gasket. This is this pink foam that rolls out in a nice big long strip, and you attach it to the bottom of the wall before you stand it up. Now this gasket is going to be useful for protecting against water and wind to try and come in under the wall. It also keeps insects from coming in under the wall, and it also helps to fill the gap between the wall and the concrete to make sure you have a uniform seal there. This is totally optional, but I thought it would be a good idea. Once the sill seal was installed, that's a little hard to say, then we stood up the first wall, and when we did this we realized just how heavy it was with all that sheeting on there. This big long 16-foot long wall was really hard to maneuver around. In fact, we wound up having to grab an extra 2x4 and use it as a lever on one end to get the wall up high enough to get onto the wall anchors. Having learned from this, we sheeted the second wall a little differently. And as soon as the wall was standing, we tacked it up with a couple of extra long 2x4s that I had previously laid out just for this purpose. This will just help make sure that the wall isn't going to fall over on us while we're building the next one. We also went ahead and temporarily attached a few of the anchor bolts. You'll see I'm going to come back later and do these more securely, but this just helped make sure that the wall wasn't going to go anywhere. So with the second wall, before we did any sheeting, as I mentioned before, we went ahead and squared it up. And this process is done by measuring corner to corner diagonally to make sure you have exactly the same measurement. If you don't, just tap one corner or the other and measure again. It doesn't take much, and these walls were nice and square. We decided rather than sheeting this entire wall and making it really heavy like the first one, we would only put in the top course of sheeting, which would make it lighter and give us something to hold on to while we were raising the wall. Again, we installed the sill seal on this wall, and then stood it up and dropped it on the anchors. And once it was standing, it was easy to put on that bottom course of sheeting. And just like the first wall, we also attached it to the anchor bolts. Alright, so that's it for the 2 long walls. My end walls, or my gable walls, are significantly more complicated. So we're going to take our time explaining what I did there. As with the long walls, we started by drilling holes in the pressure-treated lumber for the bottom plate, and these holes are drilled to match exactly where the anchors are in the concrete already. And if you didn't see the video where I explained all about these anchors and how I got them exactly where I wanted them to be, you can check out the link that appeared here at the top. Once I had those drilled out, then we marked the top and bottom plates just like we did with the long walls. Although rather than marking at 16-inch centers, this wall is mostly going to be a giant doorway. In fact, both of my gable walls are going to be basically big giant doorways. So we framed out the perimeter of the wall and the doorway in the center. Now, doors and windows are both just a little tricky because you have 2 studs right next to them. One's going to be a little shorter than the other because it's going to have a header put on it that's going to stretch across the top of the door. Now the shorter stud, I believe, is called a jack stud, and the stud next to it that goes all the way up to the ceiling is called the king stud, although I might have those mixed up. I'm not a framer after all. So once I've got my jack stud and king stud measured and cut, I laid them out and attached them together so that we could then next build the header. Now the header is made as kind of like a 2x6 Oreo, where the 2x6s are the outer cookies and the inner cream is this OSB. It's the same OSB sheeting I used for the outside of the walls. When you stack them this way, they wind up being exactly the same thickness as a standard 2x4. So then the header for the wall fits in perfectly right on top of the jack studs right next to the king studs. So we got the header all nailed in place, and then it was time to put on the top plate. So the framing above the header is a little tricky. I needed to have these 2x4s that were about 3 or so inches long, and if I tried to put these in with the nail gun, they would just splinter and explode. They're just too small. So rather than trying to use the nail gun, I went ahead and pre-drilled some large bore holes about halfway through them, and then I finished that with a pilot hole almost all the rest of the way through. And then I just stuck them to the top of the header with some screws. This is a nice clean connection, and it's plenty strong enough for what I need to support that top plate of the wall. Once those small little studs were put in, then it was time to attach the top plate. And we double checked and triple checked that the doorway was going to be perfectly centered and square in this wall, and then just nailed in the top plate. So there's one more thing to do before we stand this wall up, and that's to deal with this bottom plate. It currently stretches all the way across the bottom of the wall, including right through the threshold of the doorway. Now that's eventually going to be cut out, but I didn't want to cut it all the way out through from the top down because then I might wind up scoring up my concrete and dulling my saw blades. So I just cut halfway through from the bottom so that later when the wall is stood up and in place, I can cut from the top down and meet that slot that I've already cut. Quickly installed some vapor barrier at the sides that are going to remain, and then we were ready to stand up this wall. We stood it up and tacked it in place, and then we built the other gable end wall exactly the same way. Once both of them were installed, it was time to square up the entire building. And this involved a little bit of pushing, a little bit of shoving, a little bit of cussing, but eventually we were able to get all 4 corners perfectly level and square. Alright, on to the rafters. So we started the rafters by putting up these extra 2x6 scraps that are going to be useful to help make sure that the first gable end rafter doesn't go anywhere. Once those were in place, we brought in both the gable end rafters, stood them up, and attached them to these supports. Now we're starting with these because we're going to use them to line up all of the rest of our rafters. So the idea for doing that is first we'll attach this small piece of scrap wood to the very top, and then we'll put a screw into it and attach a string to that screw and stretch it all the way across the entire length of the building to the other gable end rafter. We'll pull that string really tight, and this will now give us a very straight line from the peak of one rafter at one end of the building to the peak of the other rafter at the other end of the building. We can then use this to make sure that each of the rafters is perfectly centered as we stand them up. So as we're standing there admiring our nice straight plumb line that we're going to use to install all of our rafters, it dawned on me that we forgot the second top plate on top of the walls. See, I'd always intended to put a double top plate on these walls. I just somehow got too excited in the build process and totally skipped it after we'd stood up the building. So we had to undo an awful lot of the stuff that we had just done with these rafters and bring in the windows that I built in a previous video to check to make sure that everything was actually going to fit. And it's a good thing we did this, because without that extra double top plate, the window would not have fit correctly. So we popped the window up there and just held it in place to measure carefully for the top plate on either side of the window, and this is going to have the effect of raising that rafter an extra 1.5 inches, so there's a little bit more space above that window to do the framing correctly. So once we'd figured out the exact measurements we needed for the top plate on either side of the windows at both ends of the shed, we got those cut and installed, and then we dropped the rafters back upside down and were able to easily install the longer top plate that goes along the long walls. Alright, top plate has been doubled, and now we're back on track. And then before we brought in each of the rafters, we went ahead and marked the tops of the top plate of the wall at 24 inches on center, as that's right where we're going to stick the rafters. The tops of the walls are all marked, and we're ready to bring in the rafters, but first, Spencer's got to make sure that he looks good. So we brought in the rafters and just let them hang upside down so they'd be easy to get to as we were ready to stand them up. With that plumb line strung across there, standing these up was really pretty simple. We just rotate them around so they were standing in about the right place, put them on their marks on the top plates of the wall, and then shimmy them left or right, side to side to make sure that they were centered under that string. And at this point all we're doing is toenailing them into the tops of the wall, just barely enough to hold them up vertical, so that we can get all of them standing. And as soon as we had them all up, the next thing we did was immediately installed some extra bracing across the tops to maintain their spacing and add some extra structural rigidity to them until we could get them sheeted. So that's more or less it for most of the framing. I did go back and replace the original wall anchors with something a little bit more robust. The original anchors came with just some galvanized washers, and the galvanized steel, although it's pretty corrosive resistant, the chemicals that are in this pressure treated lumber can eventually eat through that. So I ran to the store and grabbed some larger stainless steel fender washers, and at each of these anchors I popped down the stainless steel washer first, and then the galvanized washer on top, and then replaced the nut. Now that we were sure everything was squared up and in exactly the place where it belonged, I went ahead and cranked these down nice and tight. And then the final step to the framing that I'm going to cover here is these special nails. These are called MyTech nails, and I use these to attach what are called hurricane ties to each of the rafters. This is a much stronger connection than the toenailing was to attach these rafters to the tops of the walls, and it'll make sure that those rafters aren't going to go anywhere even in very strong winds. Well, that's it for this video. The bulk of the shed is now framed. In the next video I'm going to cover the rest of the framing that I had to do inside those gable end walls around the windows and the vent holes, and we'll talk about sheeting all of the rest of it, including the roof. So before I sign off, I've got to give a huge shout out and thank you to my buddy Spencer, who came over and spent 2 full days, sun up to sundown, building this shed with me. I couldn't have done it without your help, Spencer. Thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed this, maybe learned something. If you saw something that I could have done better, please let me know down in the comments. And hey, thanks for watching.